about 10 miles into some hills where we pitched our pup tents and bivouacked for about 3 nights, preparing to leave by truck to go up the Rhone Valley. At that time, the line was up around Epinal. So Marseille has changed a great deal since that time. We drove to Aubagne, where we visited the museum and headquarters of the French Foreign Legion. The museum was quite interesting. We then moved on to Aix-en-Provence for lunch in the city square, and then to Avignon to visit the Papal Palace and the bridge made famous by the song Sur le Pont d'Avignon. In 1309, Pope Clement V moved his residency from Rome to Avignon, and it remained there until 1377. During that time, 7 popes resided there. This immense Gothic building, with walls 17 to 18 feet thick, sits on a natural spur of rock that renders it almost impregnable to attack. Again, as we wandered around the inside of this impressive structure, I had the eerie feeling of being there 700 years later. Also, the construction of this huge edifice required enormous skill considering the tools that were available then. The Rhone River and the famous bridge were nearby. We were there overnight at the Hotel Ibis. On October 24, 1944, Allied forces occupied Avignon unopposed, and by August 28, 1944, both Toulon and Marseille had capitulated to the French. The forces were moving rapidly toward Montélimar, and Task Force Butler was moving west over the mountains, also toward the Montélimar area. Today is about 66 years later than when I was last in Lyon. 103rd Division left Marseille by truck. It's about 199 miles from Marseille to Lyon, and we rode in 2.5-ton trucks in one day, arriving after dark in October of 1944, and spent the night in a large city park which seemed at the time to be in downtown Lyon. On the way up, we passed through a little town of Montélimar, at which point a vicious battle had taken place when the Americans tried to trap a significant part of the German army in the south of France. The 36th Division had left the landing beaches and had gone up the route Napoleon, across the mountains, and had come down above Montélimar, where the road narrows because of its proximity to the Rhone River, which is quite large there. When we came through about 2 months later, there was still all manner of wrecked vehicles that had been bombed and burned, and there were carcasses of dead horses on the side of the road. It was unbelievable, the destruction that had taken place of the German forces in that little narrow valley about 8 or 10 miles north of Montélimar. I don't think it rained on us that day, but it was getting cold, and sitting in the back of that truck all the way from Marseille was a chilly experience. Today, as we toured through that area, it was raining quite hard, so we were somewhat limited in what we could do to go on foot to see the area, particularly around Hill 300, where the 36th Division actively attacked the German columns that were fleeing up the road out of Montélimar in the direction of Lyon. We are in a hotel now in Lyon, just down the street from the one where the infamous Klaus Barbie stayed when he directed the German operations in the city here that led to the confinement of many French Jews in the German prison camps. Tonight we're going out to dinner, and tomorrow it's on to Besançon. Almost 66 years to the day since I was there. On the morning of Wednesday, September 8, 2010, we departed Lyon for Macon and the Burgundy country. We visited the delightful small town of Cluny, home of a very famous abbey. We visited the ancient campus of the university there and then drove on through the magnificent wine country to the ancient village of Brancion. Situated on a hill overlooking the Gros Valley, Brancion offers breathtaking views of the Burgundy countryside and its mix of fields, farms, and rolling hills. We visited the ancient Romanesque church and saw the famous castle there. We motored on through this magnificent wine country, stopping briefly for a wine tasting and a visit in the lovely village of Chardonnay, with its ancient buildings and lovely flower boxes. In the early afternoon, we arrived in Besançon. September 8th, 2010, the date that we arrived, was the 66th anniversary date of the liberation of the city of Besançon by the American 3rd Infantry Division. This historic city, situated on the River Doubs, was the birthplace of Victor Hugo. In the days of the Roman conquest, Julius Caesar was there. Amazingly enough, in just 23 days, the American 7th Army had moved about 320 miles from Marseille and would soon thereafter link up with the American 3rd Army just north of Dijon, and was poised to break out into the Alsatian plain. Almost 66 years earlier, I had been in Besançon. On January 21, 1945, I was transferred to the American 46th General Hospital, which was in that city. In the 3 weeks that I remained there, I was not able to leave the hospital, but from my bed, I had a grand view of the city below the mountain on which the hospital was located. In Besançon, on the afternoon of September 8, 2010, we visited the Citadel, an ancient fortress that was built by the famous architect Vauban, atop one of the neighboring mountains. Uniformed members of the French army were there for a commemorative ceremony. They still wear the rather odd-looking square cap made famous by Charles de Gaulle. All these years I had presumed that this famous old fortress had been the location of the 46th General Hospital, but this proved not to be the case. I inquired of the museum guides as to the wartime location of this American hospital, and they informed me that it had been in Fort Beauregard, also referred to as Fort Frégille, on a neighboring peak. After looking at internet pictures of this ancient fort, I believe that the 46th General Hospital was there indeed. We were told that the fort is now used by the city's zoo for animal care and is not open to the public. It was a disappointment that we could not go there. However, we did visit the Citadel, a rather remarkable structure itself. It is now a museum that is devoted to World War II history, and the major emphasis is on the German concentration camps and the atrocities that took place in general as orchestrated by the Nazis. The evidence on display there is sickening, to say the least. Thursday, September 9th was an eventful day. Driving from Besançon, we went to the Montbéliard, Belfort area and the region of entry into the Alsatian plain through Belfort. We visited an old fort on a mountain outside of Belfort, and then motored northwest to Épinal. I knew that in World War I, my father had seen battle in 1917 in the Épinal area while serving as a second lieutenant assigned to a machine gun company in the 371st Infantry Regiment. 27 years later, in early November 1944, the 103rd Infantry Division had moved from Lyon to a staging area near Epinal. It is interesting how history repeats itself. In nearby Remiremont, we had lunch in the city square and then visited the American cemetery just outside Epinal. Once again, this proved to be an emotional visit.
Go ahead.
We were in the cemetery outside Epinal, where we found the graves of 7 men from A Company of the 410th Infantry, including our company commander, Captain William Phillips, and another sergeant with whom I was very fond, Sergeant James Rainwater. I also found the grave of First Lieutenant Wilfred Connor, who was in B Company and was killed just outside of Ittersweiler on November 29th. This is a very special reminiscence, just a little short of being 66 years since the night that Captain Phillips and I were standing together, and a short time later he was dead. We are honored to be here. The perfectly symmetrical and manicured cemetery is the final resting place of 5,255 military dead, including 6 soldiers from A Company, 410th Infantry Regiment. The A Company commander, Captain William Phillips from Corbin, Kentucky, is there, as are Sergeant James Rainwater, Sergeant Robert C. Thomas, Sergeant Wilbur Hayes, PFC Paul J. Sr., and Private Edward Green, as well as a good friend, First Lieutenant Wilfred Connor of B Company. We located their grave sites. As I stood beside these grave sites, I wondered how often, if ever, relatives or friends have visited these grave sites. We met with the superintendent of the cemetery, a young American who thoughtfully honored our visit by presenting me with an American flag that had flown over the cemetery. With an emotional farewell to my comrades in the Epinal Cemetery, we motored to Saint-Dié, a short distance away. On our tour, we arrived in Saint-Dié in the late afternoon. The ancient cathedral seemed to be about the oldest building in the city. All of the cathedrals in the Alsatian area are built of sandstone instead of the limestone that we had seen elsewhere in France, and they have a reddish-brown color. Most of the buildings in Saint-Dié were obviously of post-war construction. We enjoyed a fine dinner in a nearby restaurant. Unfortunately, time did not permit a visit to nearby Herbeville. The Meurthe River flows through the middle of Saint-Dié, and in contrast to what I had seen 66 years earlier, the river flowed gently through the city far below the flood stage I had seen previously, and was very peaceful and quiet. As we crossed the river on the bridge in the middle of town on our way to the restaurant, I marveled at the contrast. Now here I am with Justin and our new friends, crossing the Meurthe River ever so easily. On Friday morning, September 10th, 2010, we drove across the Meurthe River and located the monument in the city of Saint-Dié that has been erected to the honor of the 103rd Division. There is a second monument to the 103rd Division in nearby Saulcy-sur-Meurthe that we also visited briefly with the usual picture-taking formality. This was an eventful day. As on the drive out of Saint-Dié, we followed Route N415 to Kaisersberg. Again, this was a relatively narrow, very winding road across the mountainous terrain. Kaisersberg was a charming village. It was the birthplace of Albert Schweitzer. It is replete with tall chimneys, and on the top of many is a stork's nest. The chief architectural design utilizes stucco and wooden plank construction, replete with gorgeous flower boxes everywhere. A stream flows through the middle of town. There are vineyards everywhere. A golf course is nearby. We toured the village on foot, visited the museum, enjoyed a bite to eat, and then went to the nearby vineyard where the 3rd Division had been involved in a fierce battle in 1945. In the course of that battle, a company commander, First Lieutenant Charles Murray, courageously engaged the Germans in a fierce firefight for which he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. It so happens that Lieutenant Murray was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and is a close personal friend of our guide for this trip, Captain Wilbur Jones, who took us to the exact spot where below a wooded hill behind this vineyard, the American forces watched as Lieutenant Murray almost single-handedly drove the Germans from the vineyard. Wilbur Jones provided us with a graphic description of this brave action. As Justin and I stood there on that spot on this gorgeous September day, midst the peacefully beautiful vineyards and the total quiet of this area, abundantly aware of Kaisersburg beauty, it was hard to imagine that anything so brutal could have occurred there. After enjoying Kaisersburg's quaint beauty, we motored on to the Colmar area in the southern part of the Alsatian plain. Colmar is generally regarded as one of the more interesting cities in Alsace. It was the home of the famous French sculptor Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who created the original Statue of Liberty that stands in the New York harbor. A replica of this statue stands in the city square in Colmar. There are many waterways in this area, including the nearby Rhine River, the Rhone-Rhine Canal, the Colmar Canal, and the Ile, Thur, Fay, and Loche rivers. A few miles to the east is the ancient city of Neuf-Brisach. Although our tour group was in and out of the area in the afternoon, Colmar proved to be a very difficult problem for the 6th Army Group from the time they reached the Belfort area in mid-September 1944 until mid-February 1945. After General Eisenhower had ruled out a quick sweep up the Alsatian plain, the assignment for the capture of Colmar was given to the French. But by November, they still had not been able to capture the town. In November, Generals Eisenhower and Bradley had been to Saint-Dié and met with General Devers, Patch, and Haslip, and had again reaffirmed the strategy that there would not be an effort by the 7th Army to cross the Rhine at Colmar, Rastatt, or any other place, and that the primary task of the 7th Army was to protect the right flank of the 3rd Army, farther to the north. There was also a conversation about an effort by the French to move to Bordeaux to clear that area of residual German forces. Accordingly, Colmar became a pocket of German resistance. It was about 35 miles in diameter, and there was access across the Rhine on 2 intact bridges. For some reason, Adolf Hitler was determined that the Germans would hold on to Colmar. The infamous Nazi Heinrich Himmler was placed in command of the German forces in this Colmar pocket. After the German attack in the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, the Allied attack on Colmar was put on hold. Despite periodic and then sustained vicious fighting beginning in late January 1945, Colmar would not be conquered until February 1945. On our brief visit to Colmar, we visited the museum at Jebsheim and saw the replica of the Statue of Liberty by Bartholdi as we drove through a city square in Colmar. In the course of the day, we motored also to an area just outside Colmar near Holzwihr and visited the field where a very courageous First Lieutenant in the 3rd Division, Audie Murphy, On January 27, 1945, staged a one-man battle from atop a disabled tank and completely repulsed a German attack. For this bravery over and beyond all imagination, Audie Murphy was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. We stood at the precise spot where he mounted the tank and where miraculously he escaped death as he fired a .50 caliber machine gun at the German forces, killing a great number of the enemy. As a chilling end to this eventful day, we motored to an area north of Saint-Dié where the only German concentration camp in France, Struthof, had been located. As one stands on the peaceful mountainside in the midst of this camp, the eye-pleasing panoramic view is breathtaking, to say the least. The view and the mindset then quickly change as one walks the grounds, sees the crematorium, the experimental medical facilities, the gallows, the barbed wire, the crude barracks, and as one imagines the torture and torment that prevailed at that time. It is difficult to imagine that mankind could have been so capable of delivering such cannibalistic treatment to his fellow man. The beauty of the countryside is in such contrast to the inhuman treatment that was doled out to the inmates of this concentration camp that once again it defies imagination. For about 2 hours as we strolled the premises, we dealt with this internal moral and emotional conflict. After our visit to Struthof, we motored to Strasbourg in our accommodations at the Best Western Hotel. Unfortunately, we had had such a busy day on Saturday, September 11th, that we did not have time to visit this very interesting city of Strasbourg. Early Saturday morning, we motored to Hagenau and then northwest to Mertzwiller. Now, after the 103rd Division had emerged from the High Vosges and had captured Sélestat at the end of November 1944, the 1st Battalion, 410th Infantry Regiment, was moved to a rest area where we were treated to showers and clean clothing. This was the first time I had removed my clothing since we left Marseille, and it would be the only time that I did so. On December 8, 1944, we were moved to the village of Mertzwiller on the Sentimental River just to the west of Hagenau. There we relieved an element of the 45th Division that had been involved in costly fighting. As might be expected for that time of year, the Sentimental River was at flood stage, whereas normally it is a relatively small stream. December 10, 1944, 103rd Division crossed this river right behind me, the Sentimental River, early in the morning after a terrific artillery barrage here in Mertzwiller. Our company was located just to the northwest of here. We were able to cross on a railroad bridge, and by 10 o'clock or 10:30 in the morning, the division had completed the capture of the town of Mertzwiller, and we then began to move on up toward Wissembourg. At the time, there was an old refinery somewhere here that had a great smokestack that we sort of used as a reference point. There was a tremendous flood here, and most of the division had to cross this little river, a flooded river, in rubber boats. My company crossed over an old broken railroad bridge that we repaired just in this direction. After that point, we went into Division Reserve and marched on up to Wissembourg. In 1944, after the Germans attacked in the Ardennes on December 16th and began moving toward their goal of Antwerp, we sensed that something was happening somewhere, but we didn't know what it was. We were told that the Germans were infiltrating the American positions wearing American uniforms. Our suspicions were confirmed when, without warning, we were loaded into trucks in Wissembourg in the early evening and carried all the way across the front of the 7th Army from the right flank to the extreme left flank, where we relieved the 6th Armored Division of the 3rd Army so that it could move north toward Bastogne. In the early morning hours, we arrived in the area near Sarreguemines. Our drive from Haguenau to Biche on September 10, 2010, confirmed what I had read about this area. It was mountainous and very densely forested. The roads are few and far between, and it certainly is not tank country. Biche itself is historical because of the fortress there, the citadel built atop a mountain peak. We visited this ancient fortress that had been designed also by Vauban, the same architect who designed the fortress in Besançon. Again, the construction defies imagination. From atop, there is an unobstructed view of the countryside. The ancient cannons still stand, and the interior is something to behold. The region nearby had been the assigned battleground of the 100th Division, and that division had been forced to modify its gains when the Battle of the Bulge began. The entire 7th Army had been moved from the offensive to a holding position pending the outcome in the Ardennes. After thoroughly exploring the fortress, we departed Biche and drove back to Haguenau and on to Sessenheim. On January 1, 1945, the Germans attacked through the Biche area, through the area northwest of Wissembourg, and out of Colmar. This was Operation Nordwind. In planning the attack, they had the choice of moving down the Saar River Valley or of attacking through Biche. They chose the latter. Had they chosen to attack down the Saar Valley, the 103rd Division would have been their first obstacle, and we would have had a tough go of it, I'm sure. Here is another example of the luck of the draw. Fortunately for us, our front remained very quiet and relatively inactive, whereas the 44th and 100th Divisions were heavily engaged in the area around Biche.
We're standing on the road right outside of Sessenheim, and we came to Sessenheim on January 18th, 1945, having been moved over by truck from the Sarreguemines area. We arrived here in the middle of the afternoon and were told we would attack at 4:30 in the afternoon. A Company and C Company were to attack from somewhere in those woods, the objective being a railroad track.
Point again.
At about 4 o'clock, the Germans began a mortar barrage on A Company, and we never got started that afternoon. It got dark very soon thereafter. We were right next to a house that had a concrete pillbox in the yard, and that evening I had to go back to battalion headquarters, where the battalion commander expressed great dismay over the fact that C Company had gone into the woods and A Company had not. And so he ordered that the next morning at 6:30 there would be a second attack. And so A Company did go in across the opening the next morning at 6 o'clock, 6:30. And it was there that we had a rather vicious fight with rifles and carbines with the Germans in the woods.